When we focus on flow in a company, everybody's objective is now achieved. Planning can schedule supply and demand, and the shop floor can execute the schedule, and quality can meet specifications, and purchasing is getting what we need when we need it. But understand there's very specific ways to design this flow-based operating model. And you might want to refer back to the DDMRP recording from yesterday, which will give you some insights on that. Now, to keep this flow-based operating model sustainable, it's about metrics. Everybody knows, everybody behaves how they are measured. And so the metrics have to fit the relevant range. It has to fit the tactical relevant range, has to fit the operational relevant range, has to fit the strategic relevant range. It also must fit that flow-based operating model. Metrics are what causes people to perform. And so those metrics have to be reconcilable. And notice, it's reconcilable. It's not aggregate and deaggregate. All right, as you get into balanced scorecard, even in the term it tells you that as you start to disaggregate metrics, you get into a position where you now have metrics in conflict with each other. Flow-based metrics should never bring an organization into conflict with each other. It should not exacerbate variability. It should bring alignment. So that's what's really critically important. The flow-based metrics then lead to, the non-flow-based metrics lead to conflicts and distortions. And what happens is obscures what is relevant. The flow-based metrics bring out what is relevant. Now, the last one is we look at tactical reconciliation. Now, it's funny. Dick Ling and I and Chad worked on this slide for a very, very long time, and Dick and I kept fussing around with trying to find a pipe connector to connect an operational relevant range with a strategic relevant range, because the assumptions and the information between the two sides differ. And we kept looking at pipe connectors, and every pipe connector we looked at, it showed either a valve or a pressure gauge, and then it hit us. You goofies, it isn't about connecting pipes together, because pipes only run in one direction. It's about a bidirectional reconciliation, and this has to happen in a bidirectional and iterative fashion. Strategy must be influenced by operational capability. As I've always told my students, the only source of sustainable competitive advantage is to exploit your unique operational capability that provides value to the customer at a profit to yourself. It's the only thing that's sustainable. But at the same time, our operational capability must be influenced by where we think the company's going to go, by the strategy. So this is a bidirectional. This is a bridge between two different worlds. So how are we doing at that? I always love when Chad asks, so how's that working for you? Well, let's take a look at what our conventional failure is. As we look at traditional S&OP, what's the result? Well, the result of the traditional S&OP and the failure that we have is that S&OP then leads to a tactical master production schedule. And master production schedule is a statement of what I can and will build. That then drives the operational side, which drives MRP. Well, think about this. As we look at MRP, rarely do the dates and quantities synchronize. And the reason is because convention fails to manage those relevant ranges correctly. Now, as we look then at the flow-based operating model, we've looked at lots and lots of different flow-based models, including, lean, theory of constraints, but they've always remained compartmentalized. And they get very frustrated. Chad and I were in a meeting some time ago with one of the top lean experts in the United States, and we were talking about DDMRP and how it builds a demand-driven operating model. This man just heard the word MRP, and he had a violent reaction to it. He's like, no MRP, no. We know this is what's been constraining lean and theory of constraints is formal planning. Then in addition to that, we look at the flow-based metrics, and the metrics directly come in conflict with the cost-based world. When we look at efficiency, utilization, overhead absorption, OEE at any resource other than the bottleneck. Well, then that brings us back to the tactical reconciliation. Reconciliation is not bidirectional. If you look at every other S&OP model out there, it's unidirectional, trying to reconcile demand with supply and coming up with a single number to drive the business. And that's not what it's about. This mismanages that relevant range. when we look at using fully absorbed cost metrics, now think about this is the cost that's in your MRP system, okay, your very sophisticated ERP system. When it says cost, it's a fully absorbed unit cost, which is labor plus overhead plus direct material cost. Now, here's the deal. Direct material costs are variable costs and therefore relevant in the operational decision. Labor and overhead are fixed costs. There's nothing you can do about labor and overhead in the short term. So when I try to combine variable and fixed cost, what ends up happening is we get the very false impression, in other words, distorted information, that our fixed costs can vary within the short range. They don't. That's why we call them fixed costs. So don't compare an apple and an orange. You're going to end up with fruit salad. Now, how about using forecasts for supply order generation? Remember, where does that MPS come from? It comes out of the S&OP process where the input is a forecast. Well, here's the 3 rule of forecast. They start out wrong. The further in the future we try to forecast, the more wrong they are. And the more detailed they are, the more wrong they are. So what have we been chasing? The Holy Grail, if only we can get an accurate forecast. Well, number 1, we can't. And number 2, even if we do, the formal planning systems today rarely will reconcile and synchronize the demand. So what we're doing is that we're committing capacity, material, and space to something that we absolutely know is incorrect. Now let's look at the flow-based operating model. You know, there's been lots of flow-based models out there. I mean, this has been around since the 70s and 80s. And conventional sales and ops planning and MPS and MRP are all configured to be a push-based model. Lay out the plan, make the plan, work the plan. All right? Now, we saw in the 70s where things like TOC and theory of constraints and lean, all right, what ended up happening is they started to come in to address some of those issues, but they remained compartmentalized. They were never taken across an enterprise. And now the question has to be, is there a flow-based model that can be implemented at the systemic level? Now, the next point is we look at the metrics. Now, conventional systems do have some flow-based metrics in use. For example, due date performance, fill rates, inventory turns. Those are all based on flow. As I improve flow, I improve each of those things. But now, what happens is, though, is they run into a wall, and that wall is the cost-based metrics. We end up in conflict. And anybody that's ever tried to do any kind of flow-based or lean implementation will tell you this, that there's 2 things they run into. They run into the metrics, and they run into the formal planning system. So now what happens is we get these conflicting metrics like OEE, operational efficiency, and fully absorbed unit cost, and what happens is it obscures what is truly relevant. And this is where the old American cartoon of Pogo, we have met the enemy, and it is us. It introduces a self-imposed variability as our people oscillate in that balance, where they're trying to find that balance and that balance scorecard of, do I do what's right for me, or do I do what's right for the company? And this is a terrible thing to do to people. It puts them in direct conflict and puts them in a place of that they're very stressed. Now here's the truth. When flow is promoted and protected, costs are under control. And typically, as you improve flow, costs go down. However, if you focus on cost, you will destroy flow. The inverse is not true. So now let's look at our systems, our formal planning systems. We have a painful reconciliation. It's a one-way street. Think about MRP systems, and remember when I was at IBM, at PeopleSoft, we brought out the first real-time MRP system. We were so proud. Well, think about it. Every time MRP runs, it cascades schedule changes as things at the higher levels recalculate down to the lower level. So it's like throwing a big rock into the water. And now I like this picture because this picture shows how nice still water would happen if a rock hit it. Well, now think about when that rock hits a water that already has waves in it already. So the system nervousness catapults down from the upper levels down to the lower level. We were so proud of our real-time MRP, and our customers said, please make it stop. Now, what's the other thing that happens? The tactical reconciliation is not bidirectional. All right? It is one way, so we get the bullwhip effect. And normally when we talk about the bullwhip effect, we only talk about it going one direction. that small changes from the end item are then shown at the raw materials. That's demand signal distortion. But at the same time, small changes at the foundry, small changes at the supplier also bullwhip up to the end item, and that's supply continuity variability. So this is incredibly painful, and this is the problem that we've been trying to solve. And now let's look at one more thing in our painful reconciliation. How about our monthly sales and operations planning updates? We treat each month as a brand new month, right? And so what ends up happening is each month we sort of do this tactical demolition, and then we start to rebuild the company based on, and amazingly looks a lot like the thing that we just destroyed. And so what we get is we get these jumps for between months, or even worse, with an ineffective sales and operations planning process, we get big leaps between the year. So how do we do this? All right, this is all, this is great. We understand the problem. Well, the direction of the solution is the demand-driven adaptive enterprise. And I'm going to turn it back over to Chad.
Great, thanks, Carol. And Carol just did a wonderful job showing how convention is failing to produce relevant information. So now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of transfer over to the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model and show you how we've built a model that is designed to produce relevant information by meeting those prerequisites that Carol identified before. So what is the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model? Well, it's composed of three components, what we call adaptive S&OP that sends business plan parameters to what we call demand-driven S&OP. Demand-driven S&OP then configures the demand-driven operating model. Now, it's not just one way like convention tends to be. Coming back from the model is what we call variance analysis or demand-driven variance analysis, and then coming back from demand-driven S&OP are things like model projections, internal innovations, and strategic recommendations. So you essentially have a tactical and strategic loop, feedback loop, always occurring here. Now, on either side of this is a market interface. On the left-hand side, we get an actual demand that is driving the demand-driven operating model, and on the right-hand side, we get the strategic market interface, which is called market-driven innovation. Now, let's talk a little bit about the prerequisites. Now, the first one was relevant ranges. So in the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model, we have clearly defined relevant ranges, the operational, the tactical, and the strategic. We also have then a flow-based operating model, which was the second requirement for relevant information, which is what we call the demand-driven operating model. Third, if you recall, the third prerequisite was flow-based metrics. To support that flow-based operating model, well, the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model has that. It has flow-based metrics at the operational, the tactical, and the strategic, and the best thing is that these metrics actually reconcile with each other. And then finally, what we see is bidirectional tactical reconciliation between operations and strategy. That was the fourth requirement for relevant information, and that's what we call demand-driven S&OP. Now, we're going to go through each of these components in more depth. So let's talk about relevant range in the DDAE model. Now, at the operational relevant range, we're dealing with the hourly, daily, weekly time buckets, okay? And essentially, now, if you're familiar with demand-driven MRP, what that means is up to the longest decoupled lead time. Now, the demand-driven operating model is going to feature these decoupled lead times at the core, because those are the decoupling points impose the independently planned and managed horizons. At the tactical range, what we have is an interesting relevant range. It blends the past, the present, and the future. So what you get is the present today, you get the short range past, and you get the short range future. So we go back at least the cumulative lead time in the past and project at least the cumulative lead time in the future. Now, there's a big difference. For those of you that are familiar with demand-driven MRP and the demand-driven operating model, there's a big difference between the cumulative lead time and decoupled lead time. Now, in the strategic relevant range, typically we're dealing with the annual, quarterly, monthly time buckets, and it's at least a cumulative lead time of the product and beyond. So if your cumulative lead time was 60 days in the adaptive S&OP relevant range, you'd be dealing with beyond 60 days. Now let's talk about the flow-based operating model in the demand-driven adaptive enterprise. What we're doing here is we're combining elements of MRP, DRP, Lean, theory of constraints, factory physics, and Six Sigma, okay? And there are four kind of core values, let's put it, of the demand-driven operating model. First of all, it paces operations to actual demand. That's that market interface that you saw that said actual demand. The next is it uses strategically placed decoupling points for lead time compression and variability mitigation. So this is how we're taking out the bullwhip in a bidirectional fashion. Next is it strategically places control points for schedule synchronization and stabilization. So typically we're placing control points between decoupling points or in front of decoupling points or between a decoupling point and a customer. And then finally, the demand-driven operating model protects the decoupling and control points through stock, time, and capacity buffering. This is how the flow-based operating model works. There's three components of it. You can see demand-driven MRP is for supply order generation. You can see demand-driven scheduling is for finite control point scheduling. And then you can see the demand-driven execution is the buffer management, the stock, time, and capacity buffer management. So what happens here is the engine of the demand-driven operating model is demand-driven MRP. It's where it all starts from a planning perspective because that's where the supply orders are generated. Actual demand is combined with other elements in what's called a net flow equation, and out of demand-driven MRP comes manufacturing orders with request dates and purchase orders and stock transfer orders. Now, the demand-driven scheduling returns manufacturing orders with promise dates, and demand-driven execution returns on-hand and synchronization alerts based upon those POs and STOs. Now, there's also a connection between scheduling and execution, and that is demand-driven scheduling sends released manufacturing orders to execution, and execution then feeds back manufacturing order progression in relation to flow and buffers. Now, all of this model, essentially the DDMRP and the demand-driven scheduling, is all really configured by demand-driven S&OP. So you can see that this model configuration is coming directly from demand-driven S&OP, which is in the tactical relevant range. And once again, this operating model is in the operational relevant range. And then what's happening is you get a variance analysis return loop that is looking at past performance of the model, feeding back into DDS&OP for model reconfiguration. Now, essentially a demand-driven operating model is designed for flow. And here's just an example of what it can do for a company. As you can see, the picture up top is before the implementation, and you can see the floor after the implementation where things are, only where they need to be. They're not overloaded. The business did not fall off. In fact, sales actually increased. You can see that lead time crashed and the amount of work in process went down. Flow definitely went up. By the way, that company is a case study at demanddriveninstitute.com. Now let's talk a little bit about flow-based metrics. Now, in a demand-driven adaptive enterprise model, we've got to have those flow-based metrics that are going to coincide with all the relevant ranges. So what you can see here is you've got the operational, tactical, and strategic. Well, we've got a metric suite here at each of those points. With regard to operations, what we have is what we're really looking to measure is system reliability, system stability, and system speed or velocity. In other words, really it's the operational model reliability, the operational model stability, and the operational model velocity. Now, we're not giving you specific metrics only because the specific metrics are going to be dependent upon the environment. But we're giving you the message behind the objective. We're giving you the metric objective and the message behind it so that companies can tailor their very unique or specific circumstances. In the tactical relevant range, what we're looking for is system improvement and waste reduction, local operating expense control, and strategic contribution. And then at the strategic relevant range, we're managing those three things that we really care about: contribution margin, working capital, and customer base. Now, what we've done here, if you look over here, we've got some kind of symbols that kind of give you a feel for the kinds of metrics that you would see. We've got stoplights at the operational. Why? Because that's the here and now. We've got run charts in the tactical. Why? Because we're measuring performance over certain periods, typically the short range pass or projecting in the future. And then we've got this target chart here because at the strategic level, these are the three things that really matter. Now let's talk a little bit about tactical reconciliation. How do we reconcile that strategic relevant range with the operational relevant range? And it all comes together at demand-driven S&OP. Now, there's basic elements of demand-driven S&OP. First, it's tactical configuration or reconciliation. This is shaping the model to the evolving business strategy. Then we have tactical review, and this is simply measuring how the model has been performing using things like run charts, using demand-driven variance analysis. And then we have tactical exploitation. This is short-range supplements to flow when necessary or visible. Can I pull in some outsourced work? Do I need to send some work out? Do I have a short-range sales opportunity based upon some capacity that I've revealed? How can I squeeze more cash in the tactical relevant range out of the operating model? We also have tactical projection, and that is projecting the model performance under different scenarios, and that feeds back to the strategic side, showing whether we can meet certain objectives. And then we've also then got strategic recommendation. This is ideas for better model performance that needs senior level approval. So you make a business case that says, look, based upon our operating model performance, if we did this and this, this would be the result. It could be the addition of a third shift. It could be a new CNC machine. But these are things that the demand-driven S&OP team cannot make the call on. They might be particularly expensive, or they might need, well, they're definitely going to need senior level approval. Now, what DDS&OP is, it's a bi-directional tactical reconciliation hub. Okay, so we've talked about the model configuration and variance analysis. So that's the connection between tactical and operational relevant ranges. But coming from the strategic, what we get out of adaptive S&OP is a business plan with things like promos and line extensions, your demand, your projected demand, your capabilities, your performance targets. And what that means is that then we get a demand plan from your line extensions, promotions, and demand. And we also get a demand plan that comes back from the DDS&OP team that is the tactical exploitation opportunities. All of this stuff comes together at the model configuration where we need to then set the master settings. Now notice over here what we have something called master settings. And this is a really interesting difference between the demand-driven adaptive enterprise and our conventional enterprises. There is no master production schedule anymore. Instead, what we have are master settings or master configurations for the model. And then DDS&OP sends back to adaptive S&OP model projections and strategic recommendations. Essentially what we're doing here is in DDS&OP is we're managing the tactical relevant range. Once again, it's the past, present, and future. That means that we're at least 2 cumulative lead times of product of length in the past and future. So if your cumulative lead time, once again, it was 60, DDS&OP would be concerned about 60 in the past and 60 in the future. If it's 30, it's 30 in the past, 30 in the future. The past is the variance analysis feedback loop coming from the demand-driven operating model, where we're essentially saying, how has the operating model performed recently? And the present is the major conflict resolution between competing activities, business lines or open orders in the operating model. Where are breakdowns or threats to breakdowns to flow occurring? And then the future is the short-range model plan where we're projecting model performance as well as short-range tactical sales exploitation. Now, let's talk about the other element of the DDAE, and that's the adaptive S&OP. And really what we're looking at here, it's the integrated business process that provides management the ability to strategically define and direct